On June 23rd, many states will hold important primary elections. Now, Kentucky is one of those states that not only has a high profile race in November, but also a high profile primary that is happening tomorrow. So now in that, you have progressive Charles Booker. Charles Booker, Chucker, Charles Booker is a black state representative taking on a corporate Democrat backed by the DNC, backed by the establishment, named Amy McGrath. Now, Amy McGrath is basically Allison Lundergan Grimes 2.0. Now, for those of you who haven't heard of Allison Lundergan Grimes, well, there's a reason for that. It's because she lost, and she lost badly to Mitch McConnell back in 2014. She was someone who refused to say that whether or not she had voted for Barack Obama, and also argued that she likes coal more than Mitch McConnell. That's a Democrat, right? So now go to Amy McGrath, and she says she will vote with Trump on certain issues. And so absolutely terrible so-called Democrat, right? So now recently, as Black Lives Matter protests have really taken off, you had Booker that has just taken a commanding lead over Amy McGrath. It's about 10-point lead. He's got a better chance than she does at taking on Mitch McConnell and winning, even though, of course, polls show McConnell has a comfortable lead over both of them. Charles Booker is actually within closer striking distance of taking down McConnell than McGrath. And so even if it's a loss for progressives, it actually would be a closer loss than you would by running a corporate Democrat, which means that Charles Booker, yes, he's already a state representative, but if he were to run again, get more name recognition, and get more out there, then it's very possible that even the next election, if he's not successful now, he could be the one to topple Mitch McConnell. And so very, very important, right? So now, along with this very important primary, you have coronavirus, right? So that's limited the ability to vote in person. In fact, Governor Andy Beshear had delayed the primary. It was actually supposed to have happened a while ago, from mid-May to June 23rd in response to coronavirus. He actually issued an executive order requiring the Board of Elections to expand vote by mail, permit early voting, and limit contact among voters and poll workers during in-person voting. So it's a good executive order. In fact, unfortunately, I should say, the Board of Elections did something differently. They decided to close a whole bunch of polling places. These Board of Elections, about a week later, after this executive order, right, they directed the county clerks across the state to submit plans that included cuts to the number of polling locations in each county. Counties across the state, of course, complied with that. Louisville's Jefferson County, for example, who has a population of 767,000 people, chose a single polling place. So Jefferson County, one polling place. You also have Fayette County, with a population of 318,000, selecting one polling place. That's the University of Kentucky's football stadium. So now, all in all, according to the Washington Post, Kentucky officials have reduced the number of polling places in the state from 3,700 in a typical election year to fewer than 200 this month. And of course, the majority of the reductions happen to have happened in minority areas. Because of course. So look, I understand, like, if you want to use coronavirus to be like, no, that's it's not about voter suppression. No, it's about coronavirus. I mean, if we're going to expand voting by mail and give everybody absentee ballots, then we don't need as many polling places. Okay, well, that argument would make sense, except there is a problem that not everybody has been able to get absentee ballots. So, again, if everyone were able to get their absentee ballots and vote by mail, and you make voting easier, then I would be okay with saying, okay, look, let's cut some of the polling places. However, let's not cut all of them, and let's make sure that we still have a few in minority areas for people that decide they do want to vote in person or didn't get their absentee ballots, whatever. But, I would do it in a way right now that ensures that you can still space people out if they decide to vote in person, which means ultimately more polling places, or at least keeping a large number of them still active, not making such drastic cuts. Unfortunately, again, this is what Kentucky has done, and so with less polling places now, you're going to actually end up disenfranchising people and putting more people in danger to create, and as well as creating massive lines that people will end up leaving. And so that is the unfortunate reality. Now, according to Mother Jones, though thousands of voters have requested mail-in ballots in an attempt to avoid going in person in those lines, some have yet to receive them just days before the election date of June 23rd, when they must be postmarked. So now they're talking about Kentucky election officials saying that, well, if you don't have an absentee ballot, you can still vote in person. But wait, coronavirus and cutting the polling places, that kind of defeats the whole purpose of the mail-in ballots, doesn't it? So, look, I think they're dragging their feet, right? I mean, you cut the amount of polling places, and then you drag your feet on absentee ballots, and then say, oh, don't worry about that. You can just go in line. No, you're going to end up having voter suppression. That's what that is. In fact, again, in the counties where polling stations were cut to a single polling place, turns out in those areas you have high African-American populations. For example, in Jefferson County, about 20% of the residents are African-American. That's actually the county's, basically that's most of the county's black population. Now, Ari Berman explains that Kentucky cutting the number of polling places for Tuesday's primary from 3,700 to 200. There will be one polling place for 616,000 registered voters in Louisville's Jefferson County, where half the state's black voters live. This is going to be a disaster. And to that I say, yes, of course it will. That's it. That's what, and yet they're still going ahead with this, right? Even though it has been challenged, and ironically by a Republican, because there are some Republicans that still do actually believe in voting, even though I generally tend to say, and I understand that I kind of paint with a broad brush when I discuss the Republican Party, because generally as a party, they have been against enfranchising the vote. And so they've been in favor of disenfranchising, doing arbitrary voter roll purges, and all these dirty tricks, basically, to go and make sure that they win and that they keep an advantage, they hold an advantage, because right now they don't have the majority of voters. They don't have the majority of the people. They have the most dedicated voters, and that's how they continue to get into power, along with dirty tricks. But generally, most people don't identify as Republicans or Democrats and tend to lead still, or I should say lean, more in a left direction. That said, even though a Republican came out and said, hey, look, let's challenge, I'm going to challenge these, these polling place closures. We need more polling places. They got stopped. On Thursday night, a federal judge denied a motion in a class action lawsuit filed by Republican State Representative Jason Nemes and voters from Kentucky's Jefferson, Fayette, and Kenton counties. The lawsuit sought a court order to add more polling places to the counties, the three most populous in the state, and yet it was denied, according to Judge Charles Simpson III, saying, the issue before this court is not whether the hypothetical voter in Kentucky's upcoming primary election would benefit from additional polling locations. It's that, rather, the issue is whether the challenged election procedures result in a cognizable infringement under the Constitution or an injury under the Voting Rights Act. We conclude that it does not. So, okay. Now, the Voting Rights Act is something that's been gutted by the Supreme Court, particularly Section 5, right? So Section 5 basically allowed the government to look over and kind of police elections in states like Kentucky and Georgia to make sure that they're not doing voter suppression by purging voter rolls, black sounding names, and of course, cutting polling places in minority areas. Well, since we don't have Section 5 anymore, you can look at this. A judge can now look at this and say, oh, you're cutting polling places from minority areas? Not an infringement of the Voting Rights Act. Why? Because the Section 5 doesn't exist anymore. It got struck down. It got ended. And so, sorry, nothing you can do. This does not infringe anything. You may proceed in cutting 3,500 polling places. That's disastrous. That is absolutely disastrous, especially, again, even absent of coronavirus. The fact that you still have so many polling places in minority areas that get cut, it is very obvious what the result is going to be. Gigantic lines in African-American areas, right, which leads to the disenfranchisement of their votes. I mean, look, I know that you can stay in line, but not everybody can afford to do that. Not everybody can afford to, especially if you're working, if you are an essential employee at this point, and you still have to go to work because that can't get unemployment benefits, or you didn't get that $1,200 stimulus check or whatever. You can't afford to stay in line. Like, you got to go to work. And you got to, pay your bills. And so, yeah, a lot of people leave the line before they're able to get a chance to vote because the lines are so long, because there are no voting and polling places anywhere. And so it's ridiculous. It's another way to disenfranchise people and engage in voter suppression. And we all know how it's going to turn out, right? Is there going to be any surprise if after tomorrow, probably Wednesday, Thursday, whatever, we find out that there are, of course, gigantic lines, people running out of ballots, absentee ballots not being counted, and voter irregularities happening in these in higher minority counties? You better believe it. It's going to end up being the same kind of shit show that Georgia was. Complete and utter disaster. And it's because people in power, a lot of them want to keep it that way. And that's the unfortunate truth. Hey guys, hopefully you enjoyed that free video. Now I'm going to have to ask you a favor. Between the demonetization and the YouTube algorithm messing around with view counts, etc., we're having a hard time adjusting to the new YouTube reality, which is where you guys come in. See, we have a patreon.com/TYTNation set up to help us rely on you guys, the viewers, instead of big corporate ads. Look, you know the show. You know how I'm not in favor of big corporations anyway. So help us transition away from relying on the ad model to pay the bills and sign up to be a patron, patreon.com/TYTNation. That goes a long way to help us keep the lights on. And you guys will know that you're supporting independent, progressive media.